So Kennedy, of course, was a deciding swing vote on the court when he voted with the 4 conservative justices. The court upheld the Trump travel ban, gutted the Voting Rights Act, and allowed corporate money in politics. When he voted with the 4 liberals, the court cut back on the death penalty, declared that detainees at Guantanamo Bay have legal rights, and limited state crackdowns on immigrants. Also, his 2015 decision striking down state bans against same-sex marriage.
So, Tom, what are the areas that we should expect to see the biggest shift? I read there were 51 decisions where Kennedy went with a liberal majority while you had the Chief Justice writing a dissent. Talk about those cases. Also, tell me, is it just my imagination, or over the past 3 terms, has Anthony Kennedy not become a more reliably conservative vote?
So, Morning Joe on the Supreme Court is where all hope goes to die when it comes to the future of the Supreme Court. The big issues that Americans care about, things like abortion, Justice Kennedy being the 5th vote to uphold the core of Roe versus Wade, affirmative action is probably on the chopping block right now. We have, pardon me, areas of campaign finance law where the conservatives could go still further in eliminating restrictions on contributions. Justice Kennedy being a critical vote when it comes to same-sex marriage, for example. So even though this term he voted in 14 different cases with the conservatives to provide a 5th vote and 0 cases with the liberals, he still, over the course of years, was essential on a number of these issues. And you could really expect all of those to head in the opposite direction.
Steve Ratner.
So, Tom, Steve Ratner. So, on issues like same-sex marriage and Roe v. Wade, which have become so kind of institutionalized in the fabric of our society at this point, do you really imagine that even if Trump picks what at least some of us fear he might do, that it would literally overturn Roe v. Wade or overturn same-sex marriage, or do you think it's more at chipping away at the rights that women got and gays got under those decisions?
Well, when it comes to gay rights, I would say same-sex marriage is probably institutionalized in the country. But you have a lot of outstanding issues like employment discrimination, and there a conservative majority probably would head back in the opposite direction of expanding rights for gay Americans or same-sex couples. When it comes to abortion, I think that judicial conservatives have been relatively savvy at saying we don't necessarily need to see Roe versus Wade overruled, which might cause a big reaction in the country, but they can still cut it back a lot and send a signal to the states that they can adopt longer waiting periods, more restrictions on the kind of facilities that can offer abortion services and that sort of thing. So as a practical matter, I would say the abortion right is going to get narrowed probably a lot.
Tom, let's talk about the Chief Justice John Roberts, who of course shocked a lot of people when he sided with the White House on the Affordable Care Act, on Obamacare. He did so, I think most observers believe, because he believed in his institution. He saw himself not only as a conservative jurist, but also as the protector of institutions. Unlike Justice Thomas, who believes that you look at every case anew, you have John Roberts looking at the institution. Do you suspect that we will see a different Justice Roberts, not a more liberal Justice Roberts, not even a more moderate Justice Roberts, but a Justice Roberts that will slow the court down if for some reason he's staring at a 5-4 decision that would overturn Roe v. Wade?
Yeah, I would think when it comes to something as significant as Roe, he is, as exactly as you described, kind of an institutionalist. On the other hand, there are a lot of things that remain on the agenda of judicial conservatives that he is willing to take significant steps on. So yesterday we got the union fees decision in which he was a part of a 5-member majority overturning a decades-long precedent that said public employee unions could collect fees from non-members to engage in collective bargaining on their behalf. And that's one of, a dozen areas of the law where the Chief Justice is part of this movement. He's a Reagan administration, grew up in that context, really is a believer that the court has been too far to the left. And so he still has a way to take the court, I think.
Heidi, let's talk about whoever Donald Trump nominates. Obviously, Roe is going to be at the center of this because you can go back 30, 40 years, and it was either Sandra Day O'Connor or Justice Kennedy that was continuing to protect Roe as a legal precedent. I'm wondering, what have you heard? What do you expect from Lisa Murkowski, from Susan Collins, from any other Republicans that may hold up a nomination that could overturn Roe? And then what do we expect from Joe Manchin on the other side and Heidi Heitkamp and Senator Donnelly from Indiana? Are they going to, because they want to get reelected, are they going to blindly follow wherever Trump's nominee takes them?
Well, that is where all of the focus is going to be, Joe. If you look at the Democratic messaging that came out last night, they made very clear the two things that they're going to focus on with any nominee are the two things that Trump, quite frankly, said would be litmus tests, which are the overturning of Roe and also the ACA. He's actually said that he would choose, he said that in the past, that he would choose justices who support these things. So in the confirmation hearings, they will nail whoever the nominee is on these points. Now, the two women Republicans, yes, there's going to be a lot of focus on them, a lot of focus on the Democrats, but I think Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins are going to come under so much pressure by women's health advocates, and they have shown in the past. Now, I know, John McCain got all of the attention for torpedoing the repeal of the skinny repeal, Obamacare repeal, but who else voted against it? Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, and they did it in part on concern about women's health issues. So there will be a lot of attention paid to those two once we know who the nominee is. And then secondly, even before that, I think we're going to look at Heitkamp, Donnelly, and Manchin to see if there are any early cracks. Just last night, you could see how Trump is starting to gin this up, going out to North Dakota and hitting Heidi Heitkamp and saying she won't vote for whoever I nominate, even though she actually voted for Gorsuch. Yeah,
Heidi Heitkamp voted for Gorsuch, Noah, but boy, what a tough decision for her, for Manchin, and also for Donnelly as they're staring at an election. I know Democrats will try to push the vote beyond November. Lots of luck with that, though.
Yeah, I mean, we risk looking at the court as though it was an extension of Congress and it was just a political institution, and it's not necessarily. I mean, we're talking about the extent to which the next nominee is going to be a doctrinaire Republican down the line pushing Donald Trump's agenda. And just this term, we had Justice Gorsuch reaching across the aisle, joining the four liberal justices.
And by the way, I grew up with Republicans picking so-called conservatives and then seeing those so-called conservatives turning into moderates or Justice Souter.
Right. Or Justice Kennedy.
They always... We never figured out growing up, John Meacham, why justices would always grow left, but never grow right. But they always would grow, but they would always become more moderate or liberal.
That was, to combine with Nixon in 41, it was left-wing mission creep.
Left-wing, exactly.
Well, I mean, Justice Gorsuch joined the liberals on the court in a deportation case, for example, turning against Donald Trump. This term, you noted that the Chief Justice essentially rewrote the statute from the bench in order to preserve the ACA. And then we had this cake baking case, a very prominent case for liberals, a values case. That was a 7-2 decision because it was narrowly defined, and there were some legal principles at play there that had nothing to do with politics that led to a very consensus decision on the extent to which this individual's religious freedom had been violated. There are sometimes religious principles that I think supersede political impulses. So we're essentially now prejudging a confirmation case from a nominee who has not been named, prejudging arguments that have not been made.
Right.
I think we're probably getting ahead of the issue. And the extent to which, by the way, one of these individuals, Judge Amy Barrett, became a household name among social conservatives when she was interrogated by Dianne Feinstein and was told that the dogma lives within you regarding abortion. That the extent to which she was a Catholic might have been a problem for her from the bench. And she had brought her Catholicism into certain discussions about the death penalty, too. But the extent to which we litigate these litmus tests, they might backfire.
At the same time, we know we knew the type of justices Barack Obama was going to select, and we know that Donald Trump is going to the Federalist Society to find nominees. They're not going to give us, they're not going to give us the successor to Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Most likely not. But they might also give you a candidate.
And what Trump did was so unorthodox but savvy during the campaign was put out that list ahead of time. You know, to sort of, he even mentioned it yesterday in the White House, suggesting that this would sort of offset concerns that he's an unconventional candidate and unorthodox politician. Would he pick some sort of wacky justice? And instead, he put out this list and said, these are conservatives. These are people that Republicans can support. And maybe a question for Tom. Tom, do you have this? He suggested yesterday there are 25 names on this list. Is there any suggestion that he would go off that list for this next pick, or are there any names on this list that you think would find particular resistance in the Senate?
No, I think that the list is kind of a framework within which he's going to operate, but in reality, they're already down to about 4 or 5 different names that they've already begun to focus on, both with respect to Leonard Leo, who's coming into the White House, Don McGahn, who's the White House counsel. So I don't think they're going to have to go through that entire list of 25, and they've got no need to go anywhere else.
All right, Tom Goldstein, thank you so much for coming in this morning.
Thank you,
Tom. A lot going on. Still ahead on Morning Joe, more on the Supreme Court battle with 2 members of the Judiciary Committee, Senators Dick Durbin and Richard Blumenthal. Plus, President Trump urged Republicans in all caps
Look at that.
to pass immigration reform
quite
yesterday.
intense. Look at that, Mika.
Hours later,
Wow.
it failed
What?
overwhelmingly, thanks to the president's own party.
I don't understand.
You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
But they were in all caps.
I know.
How could they fail? Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.